conversations. Hello and welcome to This Guilty Land, Arvie Smith and Daniel Duford in conversation with Cyrus Cassells. My name is Mariana Ramirez, and I'm the director of the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at Portland State University. Today is my third day on the job, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you for this thoughtful conversation. Just a reminder to please keep yourself muted unless you're one of these speakers. Also, this program is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube later with captions. You may also view the exhibitions today on our website, and that link is going to be put into the chat. Now, I would like to introduce Linda Tesner. Linda is the former interim director of the JSMA at PSU and curated Arvie Smith 2 Up and 2 Back 2, and Daniel Duford, John Brown's Vision from the Scaffold. Linda is a veteran director, curator, and lecturer. And as my predecessor, she gave life to the JSMA with her inaugural exhibition, Art for All. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce Linda here today. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Mariana. And I want to be among the first of the Portland arts community to welcome you to Portland and wish you the best of luck with the JSMA at PSU. I look forward to meeting you in person.
Someday, soon.
Yeah, eventually. I just want to say a couple of sentences, a couple of words about why I felt so strongly about curating exhibitions for Arvie Smith and Daniel Duford. I started working on these exhibitions probably at least 4 years ago, if not 5 years ago, when I was the director of the Hoffman Gallery at Lewis and Clark College. And those exhibitions were scheduled at Lewis and Clark College for 2 consecutive years. And we could not have known when we started working together, when I started doing studio visits with Arvie and Daniel and thinking really seriously about this body of work, we could not have known then how prescient this work is and how important this work is to today's world. I just think that by some stroke of, I don't know, divine intervention, Arvie's show and Daniel's work have really spoken to the issues, social and political issues of our time. I think it's very, very important work to see. Of course, it was hugely disappointing when Arvie and Daniel's shows were opened on May 8th, and then literally 8 days later, the shows had to be closed because of the pandemic. So anyway, I just want to say thank you so much to the Ford Family Foundation, because the Ford Family Foundation funded catalogs for both Daniel Duford and Arvie Smith. And in this way, in these publications funded by the Ford Family Foundation, the exhibitions will live on to have a life, even though so few people have been able to see the work in person. So anyway, without further ado, let me introduce Cyrus. I'm going to go ahead and read these 3 bios because they're very impressive, and I want to make sure to get all of them to you. Cyrus Cassells is a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow. Cyrus has won the National Poetry Series competition, a Lambda Literary Award, a Lannan Literary Award, and a William Carlos Williams Award. His 2018 volume, The Gospel According to Wild Indigo, was a finalist for the NAACP Image Award. Still Life with Children, selected poems of Francis Parcerisas, translated from the Catalan, was awarded the Texas Institute of Letters Soirette Dale Frazier Award for Best Translation of a Book in 2018-2019. His 7th book, More Than Watchmen at Daybreak, a lyric cycle about his stay in a Benedictine desert monastery, was published by 9 Mile Books in April 2020. His 8th and 9th books, The World That the Shooter Left Us and Is There Room for Another Horse on Your Horse Ranch, a finalist for 2019 National Poetry Series, are forthcoming from 4-Way Books in early 2022 and 2024. So very, very prestigious poet, Cyrus. Thanks for bringing your insights to our little discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Arvie Smith, old friend and mentor. Arvie is a professor emeritus at Pacific Northwest College of Art, where he taught painting and drawing for over 20 years. He also taught at Maryland Institute College of Art and was visiting professor at the University of Oregon, Oregon Center of Arts and Crafts as well. He received his MFA from Hofburger School of Painting, where he was teaching assistant to Grace Hartigan. He received an honorary PhD from Pacific Northwest College of Art in 2018. In 2017, he was awarded the very prestigious Oregon Governor's Award for the Art for Lifetime Achievement. His work is in major African-American art collections in New Jersey, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Atlanta. The Portland Art Museum exhibited his work at the Apex Gallery in 2016. More recently, Arvie had a two-part exhibition, Two Up and Two Back, at Disjecta Contemporary last fall 2019, and currently at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at PSU. I'm especially excited to note that Arvie is a 2020 recipient of the Joan Mitchell Award. So applause. Daniel. Oh my gosh, I have been watching Daniel Duford's studio output for more than 20 years. And I'm passionate about this body of work going back that far. A 2019 Guggenheim Fellow, same class as Cyrus, Daniel Duford is an artist, curator, writer, and teacher. He tells stories drawn from North American history and mythology. He is a 2010 Hallie Ford Fellow and the recipient of a 2012 Art Matters grant. His work has been shown nationally at such venues as the Orange County Museum of Art, Mass MoCA, the Atlanta Contemporary Arts Center, the Bellevue Arts Museum, and the Boise Art Museum. He has held residencies at McDowell, Crow's Shadow Institute of the Arts, and Ash Street Project, among many others. He is the co-founder of Ground Beneath Us, an artist fellowship and place-based educational residency program in Waterford, Virginia, the place where the John Brown series got its start. Duford has taught at Reed College and the Pacific Northwest College of Art. He currently teaches at Portland Community College at Rock Creek. So Cyrus, I'm turning this over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually beaming into you from Hawaii. And I'm so very pleased to be part of this conversation. I met Daniel under the best possible circumstances. We met at dinner, celebrating our Guggenheim Fellowships in New York. And that sense of joy and celebration bonded us, it seems, for a long time to come. So I have a few questions and then we'll get started. This is for both of you. I wanted to begin by having you discuss two paintings that share similar subject matter and strategies. Arvie's painting, Agitate, 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 and Daniel's Abolitionists in a Flood. So could you talk about extending the legacy of historical bravery and activism into the present by shining a light on these anti-slavery champions? And maybe just talk about the role of heroism in your work, in social justice work, and the importance of having those heroes accessible there. So Arvie, you want to start talking about Agitate, Agitate, Agitate for us?
Okay. Agitate, Agitate. Well, let me start by saying, in order to work on this piece, I was commissioned to do some work on slavery in Baltimore, slavery in Maryland. And during that, the research, and I researched that project at the Schomburg, Maryland Institute, College of Art, and Library of Congress. But what I was looking for was the connection between slavery and of course the slavery in Baltimore. Now, I think most of us know that the majority of the slaves in the United States were in New York. That was the largest population. The second largest population was in Baltimore. And Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave, but for 20 years he was a slave, but he lived in Baltimore. And in one of his 3 biographies, he talks about hearing the chains of the slaves that they moved at night through Fells Point, where I lived in Fells Point. I had a studio in Fells Point. Moving through at night because the citizens of Baltimore didn't want to see or hear or smell the slaves moving through into the port, coming from the port of the Chesapeake and going to that port for shipment down south. Baltimore, Virginia, being one of the major hubs of people who were sent from the north to the deep south. So that was, and then looking further into that, also in Baltimore, I was Harriet Tubman, who was the Moses of the Black people. She made 13 trips, brought out 72, maybe 300 people, including some of her relatives. So she was the Black Moses, and through all this time, she was had a price on her head. But she also had a connection with John Brown. She and John Brown knew each other, and she actually was involved in some of the planning with John Brown on his raid of Harper's Ferry. Frederick Douglass, Brown invited Frederick Douglass to also be a part of that. And Frederick Douglass said, "Man, you're crazy. That's suicide. I'm not doing that." But Brown went on, and of course, we all know what happened at Harper's Ferry. So I wanted to express how these people had an impression on slavery, how under these horrific conditions they were able to say, no more. We're going to do something about that. And I see that in terms of how myself as an artist, see that as people, and for me as artists, I can be an activist and perhaps make changes in the world. So that's basically what the top part of that is about. And the other part is about the cruelty and the humanity. That's the below the line. The cruelty and the inhumane things that they did to African Americans just on a whim. So I wanted to talk about that. But and part of that is that we're involved. We don't mind talking about slavery. Slavery is one of the original sins of the Americas. The second one is racism. The second one is Jim Crow. And at my age, I lived through Jim Crow. I was born in the South. I understood the terror of going into town. We lived way back in the woods, but going into town with my grandfather, who was a college professor and a history teacher, going to town was, you didn't know exactly what was going on, but you felt it. You felt it, and for some reason, my grandfather always wanted us to stick with him, stay right with him. I saw the signs, colored signs. I saw the don't drink from this water fountain, et cetera, et cetera. And the facilities, which we didn't use in that town, but in traveling, I saw some of those facilities, and they weren't the type of facilities that any human being would want to be a part of. My wife is telling me I'm talking too much.
No, it's all such important history.
Yeah.
Can I share with you the fact that I have portrayed Frederick Douglass in a one person show. I did this 15 years ago at my university.
Oh,
And when you
great.
talk about the underlying cruelty, the hardest part for me as an actor, I had to be on stage for 75 minutes as Fred, with Fred's words, was just imagining the physical cruelty that he endured.
Mhm.
I worked on the play for 3 months, and I toured my local schools. I brought it to junior high kids and high school kids, and it was all his language, but it was very elaborate, because he was a great orator of his time. And at the same time, I was studying to play Othello. I was understudying Othello. It was so much easier to do Othello with pentameter than those long sentences that Fred Douglass had, because they didn't have TV. They just had Fred, right? But the
Yeah.
very hardest part of my work was just imagining the scenes where I was describing his physical battle with his master, the level of cruelty. Very, very difficult to get into that place of empathy, right? But part of what it seems so important, I've also been teaching Beloved and Toni Morrison's work this semester.
Right.
Teaching, it's just helping us to understand what it felt like to be a slave. That's been such important uh, progressive work for our culture, because it's that place where, when I think about the recent slave films, this week to prepare for this talk, I watched the Good Lord Bird, the John Brown series. I got all the way up to the last one.
Oh,
I
did
watched
you?
Harriet, which is actually very inspiring because Cynthia Erivo was quite good. It's just that it's painful even for us as African Americans to take a look back at that, right? So it's a translation process, and what I think is amazing about what you and Daniel have done is that you're bringing those. Sometimes I think in our culture we have too much emphasis on the heroic, at least in terms of media, right? And Americans are really obsessed with superheroes, and yes, Harriet Tubman was a superhero, but this idea that we could find heroic elements in ourselves is part of what I get from your painting and from Daniel's painting there.
Yeah.
So the question is, like, did you consciously decide to bring them closer to us as a present, or for us to feel like, oh, we have heroic dimensions too, if we actually allow ourselves to be inspired by that kind of integrity there that Harriet had in particular, or Benjamin Banneker is the other figure in your painting, right? How, in terms of moving ourselves so that we don't just constantly descend into despair about the racial inequities and police brutality that we're still faced with after all these decades and a few centuries there. So maybe Daniel, you can step in and talk
Yeah.
about your,
Yeah.
why you have the same heroes in your paintings. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I started this John Brown project, I mean, I really felt like I was in Harper's Ferry, and I felt like I got grabbed by the story of John Brown. And you start reading it, and that idea of the hero that you talk about, like that was, pretty quickly I realized a couple of things. This is not going to be like a historic biopic. It's not about being historically accurate in the sense it has to be correct in that way. And also, it wasn't about this kind of heroic singular figure. It was as much about the people who were around him. And that the painting Abolitionists in the Flood was one of the first that came to me, where I had this idea. I wanted to do paintings in which I was in communion somehow with these people, and they all had these connections. And so I was actually at McDowell when I did the first sketch of this, and I was in the woods in New Hampshire, where those are the kind of transcendental woods of that, Thoreau and Emerson. And so it seemed to lend itself to that. And I originally wanted them to be, I had this idea, there's those photos of the abstract expressionists where they're all like on a couch together. I had this idea that it would be this kind of like grouping like that. And as soon as I started to paint it, the flood came. When you're working on a painting, the things just show up. And then the flood came, and they were suddenly in the swampy water. And then, the water's back there. There's the Fisher King, And so in that case, he's completely, not from this kind of milieu of story, but he is the story of the Fisher King is he's a wounded king, and if it's the sovereign's wounded, the land is sick. And so I kind of thought of that in this case, but those kind of came later. But I really wanted to have this sense of these are the people who are around John Brown, and these are the people who are in this kind of fellowship, that they are looking back at us. So I, as a painter, am actually engaged in as if I really think of it as if they were sitting in the studio with me, you know, and that's the feeling I wanted to get from the painting. Not the heroic, like historical, this is the thing of the past.
So it's a conversation across time.
Yes.
And space there. I mentioned The Good Lord Bird, which I just watched, but one of the questions I have to you is, do you think the time is right for re-examination of John Brown? Is this sort of happening organically, or abolitionists in general? Why now? Why is there a particular synchronicity, you think, in terms of the work that they did and what's happening now that you can?
I do. I mean, you know, when you look at if you look at John Brown as an image and an idea, well, pretty quickly he was getting mythologized right after the raid, but also pretty quickly he was getting turned into kind of a you know, the sort of bad apple lone wolf sort of scenario. And then like he doesn't represent anything, and we're going to move on with the Civil War, and then there's this kind of like tragedy on both sides, and that's the narrative that developed, you know, where you have this the way in general the Civil War into the 20th century race and power structures are discussed. John Brown, it becomes a figure on the side. But we've seen from this last 4 years, and particularly from this last summer, I mean, if Trump did anything for us, he made us incredibly aware of our civic history and of our racial history. In a way, where I'm watching, like, you know, in the newspaper, in sort of general conversations, people talking about that moment in history. So if you do that, you have to really rethink John Brown, and you also have to think like Frederick Douglass. Again, like in a mainstream way, everyone wants to kind of, you know, kind of clip the thorns off of him so that he's a very, you know, placid figure. But, you know, Frederick Douglass was a radical, you know, and Frederick Douglass. And so those figures. And then and again, I think if you start to look, if you think of John Brown as like an aperture to begin with and see what was happening around him in a different way, there's a lot of unfinished business. There's a lot of unfinished business that we have right now, including the fact that at the moment where we have a president who's trying to say that he won the election, he's speaking about the Electoral College, which, as now we all know, is an artifact of slavery. So, you know, these are all things I think why he's really important to think about right now. And also the question of political violence. What is, you know, what is the right amount? What is not enough? I mean, in the painting, you have William Lloyd Garrison, who is an avowed pacifist, you know, as an abolitionist. And so there were those debates going on at the time. So yeah, I think it really is now the time to, again, not just him as a singular figure, but he as a doorway to a whole movement.
I think what you're saying, having just watched the series about the depiction of John Brown as a sort of crazed, lone, visionary person, right, and emphasizing the community effort. In the play that I'm writing about the Underground Railroad, which is called Dr. Free, and it's set on Beacon Hill in Boston, right after the Fugitive Slave Act. And one of the things that really interested me about the Black community in Boston is how much they banded together as a community. We're even talking children too. When the slave catchers came all the way up to Boston and were hunting. And how this play began was I was in the library in Boston and I saw this poster that said, "Colored people of Boston beware." And it really grabbed my eyes. It's going on. And then I noticed, I was writing down, I said, okay, I'm going to stop and see what this is. Then it's just a replication of the poster from 1851. It says, you know, keep top eye open, and the police are in cahoots with the slave catchers, and they're actually just pulling people off the streets. And one of the things they could do then in Boston was they could deputize you in the spot to help them catch the slaves. But what was amazing was the community was almost like 90% successful. in getting a slave away from the catchers or out of
Right.
their clutches. So this idea of community effort and community, I want to say morality in the face of what feels totally warped and unjust, is part of what appealed to me about researching that time in history of the 1850s that you've been doing as you've been depicting John Brown there. For both of you, I wanted to talk about the sort of dynamic, eye-catching colors that you use in your work. And Arvie, maybe you could talk about those powerful reds that you have and your wash of red that you use, and how that is a key element of your palette and your vision. And then Danny, you can talk about your oranges and yellows and things.
Okay. As an art professor, I've studied color. I think back in the 40s, a professor by the name of Joseph, it's not really Joseph, but Joseph Itten did a book on color. And he talked about the psychological approaches to color, the physiological approaches, the way that color affects people. And what he found is that red was the most provocative color in the color spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And I use that as an underpinning, not because Joseph says that's the thing to do. I use it because that's what I personally react to. That's what, when you say, I was so mad that I saw red, this is basically what I'm talking about. Because when I was a child, I thought all of this racism is gonna go away, and when I'm adult, they'll all be gone. Well, it's intensified. It hasn't gone away. It's taken new avenues, new ways of presenting itself. So I said, well, I have a voice. I have a voice that I can use, and I've studied enough that I can use that voice eloquently. So I talk about these inequities, these racial inequities in my work using these provocative, attention-getting colors, hoping to pull the viewer in. And once they get past the color, mm-hmm. and see what I'm talking about with the images, it's that, oh my God moment. Mm-hmm. So this is what he's talking about. So hopefully that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to pull people in and then say, take a look at this. Take a look at this. This is what our country looks like now. And it's my job to expose that.
Mm. Right.
And I can talk more about how I use that in talking about those darky iconography.
Yeah,
that
we'll get to that as well.
Yeah.
So color is a lure to get people to confront things that are troubling and unsettling and things they might want to keep at arm's length, is what you're saying. But it also seems like it's that general sense of outrage. I was trying to think of the last time I could remember an artist using reds, and all I could think of was, don't laugh, was Ingmar Bergman in Cries and Whispers. He used to have these red interludes, and all the actresses were in reds. But and to be honest with you, I'm a person who tends to resist the color red, but I would never like wear it for some reason. So I find that really powerful, in absorbing your work. That normally I don't have an antipathy for it, but I have red, which says something about me that I'll go to therapy for, Arvie, and I'll figure it out there. But Daniel, I can't get over your oranges and yellows in your. As I was saying when I sent you a message, usually I think of the 19th century abolitionists as sort of muted tintype colors, like, you know, that whole sense of that the color isn't really going to be there in the 19th century, which is absurd and has something to do with our own perspective. Like, but we're used to seeing the daguerreotypes and the tintypes and stuff. So orange and yellow just doesn't seem to go with that universe, and yet it's part of what makes your work so exciting. So you can talk about expanding the color palette for the 19th century and making those abolitionists, you know, giving some color to them instead of them just seeing that they're in grays and blacks and beiges and browns.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say, just going back to Arvie's paint, I just like, so I was writing about Arvie's work, you know, while I was also working on this.
Oh,
so
wow.
thinking about the color in there, and I, you know, and Arvie, like, I'm just looking at behind you right now, that's the underpainting that in and of itself has this, like, just kind of like vitality. So I mean, that, I think that actually probably was an influence on the paintings. But I also, a couple other places where I look at color, where I love old newsprint comics. And part of it is that we always think of comics as being really kind of primary colors, but they end up being, because they're this old printing process. You know, I'm talking about like comics from the 70s on newsprint. There's a kind of weird tertiary, like the choices are often made where you look at a figure who's supposed to be in shadow and it ends up being like kind of pink or the purple, or there's some, and I always love those kind of choices. So I look at that. But to your point of the 19th century, there was a moment where I was sitting in the studio and I was like looking at, you know, images of cloth and trying to get this kind of, you know, quote unquote reality. But I'm like, this is painting. This is a painting. This is not a photograph. It needs to be alive and be vital. And that idea of the color that Arvie talks about, where it has to have this emotional impact and a physical impact. And I think it might have even been in Abolitionists in a Flood, William Lloyd Garrison's yellow coat. You know, like all of a sudden I was like, that needs to be yellow. You know, because everything, I was like trying to get, like, I was being too polite. And I'd also, I actually was looking at the painter T.C. Cannon. I don't know if you know, he's a great, you know, Native American painter. And there's this painting he had, there was like a figure, and then there's just this like purple. And I was like, oh my God, that is just so fantastic that it's just purple. And so I think those were some of my choices, was to just to say, like, this is a painting, and part of the painting's language, its sensuality, its vitality is in color. And again, I'm trying to make paintings in which these figures are they're not just tintypes. Mm-hmm. You know, there actually are really alive, which is why it's really fun to do things like Watch the Good Lord Bird, where you actually see that, like, the cloth has this really great color, or, you know, things like that. But that's where sometimes the choice would be like, I would really think this painting, I'm just like, kind of like being too polite with this thing. You know, I think these people want to kind of yell. They want to be alive, you know.
Well, they're such dynamic folks. And remember, Arvie, back in the day where they used to have those sort of mood rings and aura color things, it's almost like you really captured something more akin to that than maybe their actual clothing.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Also, as I said in my essay about your painting, Daniel, it does create a sense of intimacy. And there's something so incredible about the pumpkin orange couch in the middle of the flood with all these famous abolitionists there that makes it seem very human and close somehow.
Yeah.
Right? And I think both of you, your color goes a long way in bringing us closer to the subjects and to the sense of struggle and the sense of their sense of dynamism there. In terms of this title, The Guilty Land, I was thinking about a line from my friend, the poet Carolyn Forche, where she wrote a book called The Angel of History, and she was describing the fields in Europe, you know, the landscape of the Holocaust, the camps of the Holocaust. And she asked the question, how can the fields continue as simple fields? And since I've been writing about Daniel's painting and thinking about landscape, one of the things that impressed me with the Harriet movie was that the landscapes were so powerful that Cassie Lemons, the director, not only she'd choose powerful, expressive actors, just their faces. There's so much love for Black people in that film. I mean, I found the film very underrated, but the landscapes were just astonishing. And to think of the slaves having to escape through such incredible beauty, right? And then I thought of Beloved, which I was just through teaching, the part where Setha, who's an escaped slave from Kentucky, she's always having to beat back her memory because of the catastrophic things that happened in the plantation. But she also says, I can remember the trees, the sycamore trees, better than everything that happened and all the kids. And I hate myself for that. I hate my memory for that. But there's something so important about the power of the landscape. And the question is whether nature or the landscape or the sites are holding this trauma, right? And I think the answer is yes. And it seems to me that part of your work is like doing a kind of exorcism on that.
Yeah.
Of traumatized landscape and history. So then I went even further, bringing it closer to home to you. It was like, well, how come the streets of Portland remained as simple streets after what happened this summer? You see this sense of how the landscape and the place and holds this trauma, and how do we exorcise it? How do we honor the suffering that went on, and then to sort of move? It's not a matter of just transcending it, but to negotiate with it. So maybe you can talk about this idea of the guilty land and the traumatic past and the traumatic landscape. Certainly, you know, with the trees, it's like they were used for lynchings, and that's the natural world that we also live in.
Right.
So maybe either one of you can speak to that, because that seems like it's there. It's maybe not as obvious as some other themes or ideas anywhere, but you did put it in the talk title.
Yeah,
So I'm like, okay, guilty land.
Yeah.
How are we going to exercise this? What kind of spell is it? Does words or images create a spell to exercise it, or create an antidote to that trauma?
Well, I think like just in a just like one of the paintings that's in the show is called "Towards the Gallows, the Empire Makes Its Way." It's a riff on a Thomas Cole painting, and he was like one of the first great American landscape painters, a sublime landscape. But you can't look at those landscapes without thinking about the removal of indigenous people, the kind of brutality of manifest destiny. But at the same time, like if you read his writing, he was really struggling with it. He just didn't have the language. And I think, but there's a kind of erasure that happens in that land, in the way we talk about land and landscape. And I think part of that in relationship to race and to patriarchy, there's a sense that like white men can view the landscape and stand behind it, and they can get it. Everyone else is closer to nature, so they don't understand it. They don't have the same relationship to it, and that's all that separation that happens, as opposed to a worldview in which it's all alive, and if it's all alive and you don't separate it all, then you have to start really rethinking all of our relations with each other, with power structures. And so Carolyn Finney has this wonderful book called White Places, Black Faces, where she talks about this like very issue. And so there's a sense, I think, when we try to separate these things, it's always, I think it's a kind of market-based mentality that makes us try to erase trauma. No, everything's like and people, like with COVID right now, and what happened in Portland, I think everyone's trying to say, okay, let's put all the shops back up. Everything's fine. But that's not how you get through trauma. That's not how you engage with the world. And so I think the way that we do this is through the image, through art, through poetry. That's the alchemy, where you actually have to just take that pain, and you have to do it in a way that you let it ferment, and not try to just get past it. And also not like deify that pain. I think that also happens too. There's that kind of sense where you deify the pain and you just hold on to it so much. So I've been even in my language, you know, we're thinking about language in terms of like gender and pronouns and things like that. I'm even trying not to use the word nature anymore and use the word the living world, because the term nature says, well, there's a thing there and then there's me over there. And that too is part of, I think, the trauma that's in the land, is the lack of communion or recognition with the landscape, not only its painful history, but also its aliveness. So that, I mean, that's kind of what I think how I'm thinking about this.
Wow, wow, that's really profound answer. Arvie, speaking of exorcisms, and could you talk about your use of minstrel imagery and dark iconography, and how you take the sort of painful images? The thing that I remembered was, I don't know if you've ever seen it, was Spike Lee's movie Bamboozle. It's about 20 years old now. It's about a TV executives who create a minstrel show and it becomes a big hit on TV. But at the very end of the film, and the end credits, is really the most magnificent montage I think I've ever seen. And it's all Mammy and Sammo memorabilia. I mean, it was a reminder of what a master filmmaker Spike Lee actually is, just with images there. So maybe you can talk about that aspect of your work, which is, I think, extremely tricky and challenging, and I think you've done an amazing job with that. So that we don't naturally recoil, for those of us who grew up with a lot of those images, right? The tendency, in other words, Arvie, is just, let's just put that in the closet, just like with the no colored allowed here signs and all of that there. So please talk about that work that you've done as a way of healing it, as a form of healing, I think.
Okay.
For me, as an African
Daniel just mentioned
viewer.
erase trauma. When I was a kid living in the rural South in Texas, we had one grocery store. And so most of the food that we ate, we grew, except for Wheaties and cornflakes. And on the Wheaties box, they would have a mask of Aunt Jemima that kids could cut out and put on your face. And it was a battle between my brother and sister who got the mask. You know, who got to wear the mask. They're teaching this to children. They're teaching this garbage to children on a Wheaties box. And then we progress to what, after all of the degradation, we all of a sudden move to a race neutral, color blind society type of notion where we can just disappear. We can just disappear this and no one will notice. Well, Black people notice. I notice. I notice when I see children being victimized from childhood. We're kept in these secret, separate little enclaves of white people, Black people, Mexican people, et cetera, et cetera. And so we never really get to know each other. And so this sickness, this legacy of racism can continue because we don't know each other. I think my first real contact with a person that wasn't an authority figure was probably a white person, was probably in college. But during my first formative years, my grandfather had started a school for the Black people in our little community. He was the only teacher, and my grandmother taught the lower schools in the schoolroom, and my grandfather taught in the church. And he took us downtown to the big town where the white people live. And he said, look, son, that's their school over there. We had books that had been around for years. I still can't write in a book because the kid below me has to get that book. And he said, they've got typewriters. And that was the biggie. But what they had was a beautiful, beautiful school, a beautiful, beautiful building where they taught white kids. And you learn that the type of money that they spend on educating a white kid is 3-4 times more money than they spend on educating a black kid. With that guidance from my grandfather, he once told me there was a altercation down at not a real altercation because you didn't altercate, but down at the gas station with the white guy with no teeth, and he called my grandfather boy, and I said, grandfather, why do you let him call you that? And he said, son, the laws don't protect us. I didn't quite understand what he meant then.
Yeah.
I understand it now.
I think you spoke very eloquently in your gallery talk about indoctrination of young people in terms of racist images, the normalization of that, the sorts of, I mean, I'm a baby boomer who grew up mostly in the 60s and 70s. And I think about, what shifted from the kind of images we had. Remember, it was a period where we still, if there was a black person on television, everybody in the town knew about. Now in such and such a night, you look in Jet magazine and, oh, someone's going to appear. And that's a whole other reality that we live through, but that seems distant from younger people now, when it was such a rare opportunity to see a black person in the media as a kind of model there. So there's a lot of, I think we're getting better with the work that you're doing, and people like Claudia Rankine talking about microaggression and indoctrination, and what seems like it's not deliberately violent, but it's still violent psychologically and sort of poisonous psychologically there. Man, these are incredible, incredible themes and subjects. And we're sort of running out of time. We only have 10 minutes more. So I wanted to ask you both about, in closing, about how COVID, the pandemic, might be affecting your vision for your work and also your work itself. If you've been producing new work, I know these things, the exhibition came out just at the very edge of the sheltering kind of lockdown phenomenon, but how is all of this huge sort of crisis affecting you as a thinker, an artist, and a person right now?
You want to go, Arvie?
Well, I can start with it. How it affects me is I spend a lot of time in the studio, a lot more time in the studio. Being, I have one graduate student, but basically being retired, I don't have to go out and interact. So it's affected me in that I wonder, the underpinning, the underpinning of our society is being exposed. Why are Black people dying more? Why is it affecting the Black community differently than it's affecting other communities? Well, like everything else, we somehow get the short end of the stick, and that's deliberate. That's in policy. And that's what we deal with. It might seem all okay on the surface, but you look at the policies. You look at the policies that give us segregated this and segregated that, and inequities here, and inequities in anything you can imagine. Housing, you imagine that, and Black people get the short end of the stick. So that's part of what I'm trying to talk about in my art. So the COVID is kind of par for the course. It's a pandemic. You wonder who's going to get the vaccine. You wonder if they're going to start issuing citations to people who don't cooperate. Who will get those citations? So,
Exactly.
you know, on the inequities show up.
Yes. How have you been able to be more creative because of the added time in the studio, or have you produced more work because of this sort of
Yeah, oh
employment?
yeah, I can't get away from it because my studio is in my home. So
That's
I
what I
walk from
thought.
the bedroom to the studio, and Cyrus, you have to be there. You have to be there. And I understand that when my studio was downtown and I'm paying outrageous money to go to that studio, you go, but you don't go as often as if you walked right across the hall.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I think I do get more work done, although I'm working all the time anyway. But I
Well,
think I am.
that's great to hear. More dynamic work from you. That's something to look forward to in 2021 or 2022 there. Hey, Daniel, what about you? How has the pandemic been affecting your
It's
experience
been
as an artist?
it's been very, so like the first right after the shut, like the kind of the quarantine, I was teaching 3 classes. So like the first couple months, I was all of a sudden like everyone else, but times 3, figuring out how to teach online. So my studio became my classroom. And then I had the second part of the exhibition for John Brown was at the Schneider Museum of Art in Ashland. And there's a part of me that was thinking like, God, this is so prescient, this work. And we're in one of the flashpoints in Portland. I've been to a bunch of the marches and it's all around the park with it next to our house. There's a lot of rallies there, and you just feel like you're there. But I kept feeling like, but it's not for me to make this imagery about this summer right now. It's that kind of like fermentation thing and that alchemy. So it actually kind of stalled me for a bit. I was trying to think, okay, I know I'm thinking about John Brown, and I know it's like really present right now. And I feel like I should be doing something that responds to right now this summer. But so what I did, I actually, took a step back. So what I did was I thought, all right, what I'm going to do is not the people who are right now doing the work, but who's in between John Brown. So I started to do portraits of people like Robert Hayden, the poet, who wrote about John Brown, or write about, Jacob Lawrence, and then start to think about that. Those people who were artists who were also looking at John Brown, but who then were the in-between place. And now, because as Arvie says, I feel like there's all these things that have been exposed. I mean, there's an incredible amount of anxiety. There's an incredible amount of uncertainty throughout everything and everyone's lives. But I also feel like there's been some ground being laid for something new to emerge. I don't know what that is. And so in my own work, I'm sort of starting to move away from John Brown specifically as a subject, and thinking a little bit bigger, starting to think about, okay, if I'm in this place, which I haven't left the few mile radius in months, what is that? What is this place? How do I find maybe the indigenous voice that's here and start to engage that? And so I don't know what the next thing is, but I do think it's important for me to remember that idea of the fermentation, where try not to react to the thing that's right in front of me, even though I am like it's where we are. But as an artist, I feel like the images have to kind of cook a little more before you just go. And because they're in Portland, there are these incredible, powerful artwork, all these murals. If you go downtown where all the marches were, there's just this beautiful outpouring of image that you see. But there's a part of me that felt like that's not that's not my role to do. That's not for me to do. That has a place for that moment, but it's not necessarily for me to do. So yeah, I think it's just like kind of navigating uncertainty, navigating this fear, and just actually kind of being awake to the fact that there's something new emerging, and I think something quite deep and quite profound, and I don't know what it is. And so that's kind of how it's affected me for sure. So like now my output, I had a huge output this summer getting ready for the exhibition, but now it's more like thinking in sketchbooks and starting to just let something kind of percolate. It's a good time in the winter to let that stuff happen underground, you know?
Yeah, I'd like to support that, Daniel. There's a turnaround period. There's a turnaround period where it sort of all comes together. And if you try to rush what's going on right now, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But after a while, it comes together and you say, oh, that's what I was trying to say. That's what I was seeing.
Great. Again, it's exciting to think about the work to come. I don't know if we're entering the age of Aquarius. There's some kind of astrological thing happening at the winter solstice with Jupiter. It's a Jupiter and Saturn into Aquarius.
Yes.
But there's definitely something afoot. And the world that we're moving into, just as it was 100 years ago with that pandemic, was a very different world from the decade before. So I think we all feel it, and it feels like a kind of uncertainty, and we have to kind of joust with it at this point. Like, well, maybe I could tackle it today, but it'll be interesting for me and for future audience to see what you do with what happened in Portland this summer, because clearly it was a test of our democracy.
Yeah.
Clearly it was a failure in terms of, our Constitution that hasn't been really fully addressed yet. So how you folks address that in art is going to be, I think, really, really potentially powerful there.
And sorry, I was going to say, I said there's bookends too. There's the political activity that this kind of communal coming together, but then there were the forest fires, which also brought this other existential threat. And those, to me, those two forces together are one story. And
yes.
They're not separate, at all.
No. I think we've essentially run out of time, gentlemen. What a privilege to listen to you talk about your work and to contemplate your work and know that it's out there, and to feel that it's parallel to some of the work that I've been doing. Much to my surprise, like you, Daniel, I resisted writing about the pandemic. Then one day I got up and I wrote my pandemic poem, and I wrote my George Floyd poem. And sometimes you just have to wait, and sometimes it arrives there. But generally, I feel like I should be taking time. But a couple points, like I wrote a pandemic poem in April that was immediately published. I think it was the fastest farm to table thing I ever did. I wrote the poem. People said, "We want this. We're publishing it tomorrow." So it's a negotiation with our reality, and how we can engage it for ourselves successfully there. So I think, do we have any time for questions? Are we completely done, or?
I think we could maybe take one or two questions.
Well, they have these important painters here. Does anybody have a question for Arvie or Daniel, or the both of them while you got them?
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to say Rafael. I just see it's from Mexico. It's someone who just joined us.
Okay, all the way from where in Mexico? Where in Mexico? ¿De dónde?
Hello, guys. I'm here in Mexico City, CDMX.
Okay.
Hello.
Well, actually, I have a question. Actually, I would put this out to all three of you. As we have a lot of students at PSU, many who may be graduating during this really tumultuous time. What maybe recommendations would you have for them, to being able to maintain a career either as a writer or a poet or a visual artist as they enter this kind of really uncertain economic situation?
Wow, that's a really big question.
Yeah.
given the economic intensity of what's going on, and that our legislature can't even bring some aid to people. So it's a particularly intense time that way, but also the spiritual demands of finding expression or art in response to what's going on are equally intense there.
Yeah.
So in terms of career, the timing is not so promising, but in terms of vocation
Yeah.
and dedication to the art, that's a different story there. Right? I don't know if that's helpful. You guys can chime in there, but I think crisis spurs maturity in people. Think about the difference between Anne Frank at the beginning of her diary when she's 12 years old and when she's 14. She grows enormously. She becomes a woman, she becomes a person. And that's kind of the potential and something as drastic as what's going on, that our young people can move beyond, something that resembles greenness or immaturity, whatever, into a full possession of their gifts and beginning to feel who they really are, because they're being tested and they're discovering, oh, I have this resource. Because in our culture, Mariana, we tend to infantilize young people's ability to deliver all the time. And the only thing that's different about me as an artist is I won the National Poetry Series when I was 23 years old. That's because a Black writer, Al Young, believed in me when I was very, very young. But mostly there's that sense of, well, I couldn't write a book unless I had an MFA, or I'm 30 years old, or whatever. Whereas in other countries, I feel like people are able to come forward and make a contribution even at the age of our undergrads and graduate students, and they have the confidence to do that. So it has to do with giving them permission to speak, right? And to be artists is a big thing. And there's something about this opening that's happening for all of us, for new expression to come through, or expression that's so urgent because so many people are struggling and grappling with not only the illness itself, but just the economic fallout. Like talking to people who've lost their businesses lately and jobs and things. So that's kind of my answer. It's like, yay, vocation, dedication to the art, spiritual expression, and economy. Well, that is a lot chancier right now. Hopefully with new leadership, we'll have, as they used to say, what was it, Obama? Help is on the way. That's going to kick in, but it's good. We still have so much resistance on the right to everything, right? To this sort of ridiculous level. So it's still going to be a struggle, but it will shift there. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I don't think we can kind of like, community, I think, is the answer, and just.
I think, Cyrus, our divisions are exposed.
Wow. Yes.
And it's always been there. And I've noticed it in my own personal life, the difference between how some of the people I know, some of the people that I consider friends, have changed, not ever so slightly, have changed from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And I'm talking about my white friends. They've sort of moved to the left, and it's a lot easier to express their feelings with impunity.
Yeah, I kind of also feel like, in terms like to the idea of like what's happening now, I don't think the structures of, like, I love the idea of vocation versus career, because the idea of a career where so I'm the next generation. I'm in my early 50s, and I remember in the 80s going to art school, all of my teachers were getting NEA grants. So I thought there was like, what it means, you go to art school, you get an NEA grant, then you get a gallery in New York, and then you're golden. And then the crash came, and then all of a sudden these new kind of forms start to come. And I think we're in a much bigger place now where educational institutions, the financial institutions, all the things that we expect are the support system for artists, or the markers that would say this, you are on the road to a career, are going to be very different. So it's very difficult, I think, to say, to someone young, like, just follow this path. There's in folklore and folk tales, there's a great motif where they get like in the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a wonderful medieval poem. The Green Knight says to Gawain, "Meet me in a year and a day at the Green Chapel." He doesn't tell him where the Green Chapel is. He just somehow has to find it, and that's the story. He's not going to say, like, put it on your Google map and they'll get there by. So and I think that we're really in a place like that, where in a year and a day we're going to have to we'll somehow get to the Green Chapel, but we don't know what the way is. But as soon as you're there and you're ready, it becomes apparent. And so I think it's hard for all of us. I think maybe the resilience and flexibility of someone young, they might actually be at an advantage, because they might not have the same expectations that if you're older you have, like, these are the markers I need to hit to call it a career.
I think it's interesting, Daniel, that when I was in art school, the thought of an NEA was just out of the question. I mean, even now, winning a prestigious award is a mystery to me, because this isn't something that happens to Black people. So I feel lucky, I feel grateful, and I also say, how can I bring my brothers and sisters along? What can I do? How can I use my voice to do that?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Cyrus, thank you for leading today's conversation with such thoughtful questions. And Arvie and Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your time and your talent with us. I'd also like to thank Linda Tesner for curating these timely and impactful exhibitions. And I would especially like to extend my gratitude to Emily Stennis for organizing today's program and keeping us all in order and together. Today's program will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can view, and you can also view both of these exhibitions on our website. And I cannot wait to welcome you all to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at PSU, hopefully in the very near future. So thank you all for joining us for today's program. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Hey, Cyrus, it's a pleasure meeting you, brother.
I loved learning about your past. We have a lot of things in common, including Watts and Texas.